How many still have them set up? All right. Well, I thought you might be interested in my train set. Where is it? There it is.
That's yours?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Whoa.
No, it's not mine. Can you see it? This is the RPI Railroad Model Railroad Societies. It's actually part of their setup. And you might recognize it.
Yeah.
And that's one of those sailboats in New York.
I told them, yeah.
Where is it?
In Troy, New York. It was in one of the lecture buildings. I think they moved it now to one of the dorms. I haven't seen it. This, I saw it when I went there in '62. And so, but I thought that was pretty cool.
That is so cool.
Yeah. So,
It's a legendary model railroad.
have you seen it?
Recreates scenes on real railways all through New England.
Yeah.
But their concept was to recreate specific locations on railroads. And to sort of lace them together with a tunnel or something. You jump a bunch of geography, but it's...
It includes railroad stations. I think the Troy station, and I'm not sure if it has the Burlington station. And as the Rutland Railroad, it's not the complete line, but certainly this is a highlight of it. Anyway, so thought you might enjoy that. So, but the reason we're really here is this. So, Carl Fowler he's a past president of the Champlain Valley chapter of the National Railroad Historical Society. He's also a train aficionado. He's spent his lifetime working to promote and improve passenger rail. He operated a rail-based tour company called Rail Travel Center from 1983 to 2017, and has served the Vermont Rail Advisory Council for over 20 years. In 1994, he says, he made the proposal for the daylight train service that became the Vermonter. So he's going to tell us about that. He's going to tell the story of post-World War II history of decline, fall, and restoration of passenger train service in Vermont and Rutland Railroad. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you. So I hope you can all hear this. This is a sort of a combined history talk and an analysis of what worked and what didn't with passenger rail in the United States since World War II. And with particular focus on Vermont because we're very unique. We have several unique distinctions. Probably the most important one is the first state that consequentially bought its primary railroad in order to keep it from being torn up, which we did when the Rutland fell into terminal bankruptcy in 1961 in the state of Vermont under Governor Hoff, purchased most of, but sadly not all of, we're sitting in the sadly not part, of the Rutland Railroad main line. The second distinction is that twice we hold the award for restoring a passenger train with the longest gap between the end of service and the resumption of service. We first hold that for bringing service back to Rutland itself in 1996, with a service that had been dropped in 1937 from Whitehall, New York by the Delaware and Hudson Railroad. That was 59 years. But we topped that last summer when we restored service over the full length of the Rutland main line from Rutland to Burlington, with the Ethan Allen Express now terminating in Burlington. That was 69 years after service had ended. And so we've got a couple of nice records there. So this looks at what we had and what we still have and tries to evaluate what our story is. The saga of the Amtrak Vermonter, and I can also add the Ethan Allen, is a lesson in the value of regional passenger rail. Vermont is a state that at one time enjoyed a remarkably high level of rail passenger service. We had multiple routes and multiple railroad companies offering options to go from as far away as Washington, D.C. in the south to as far north as Montreal and Quebec City, and briefly at one point, actually long ago, Murray Bay, and even on to, at one amazing time, Boston, White River Junction, Montreal, Vancouver, although that didn't last very long, but extraordinary option. But after the Second World War, one by one, these multiplicity of routes began to unravel. Multiple services again ran daily, primarily from New York and Boston to Montreal, but via diverse routes, as my mother, who was a Pullman reservationist, would have described it. Tariffs always provided options to go various ways. You could come one way, return another, and they called that a diverse route. For example, the Rutland offered services directly from Boston and New York to Montreal, trains which would combine at Rutland itself, the Boston section and the New York section, and form one train to go through to Montreal. But it also served as far west as Ogdensburg, New York, which had been one of those mysterious holy grails of 19th century railroading. All over New England, there were railroad companies wanted to get to Ogdensburg, New York. Now, why Ogdensburg? The idea was they were going to suck all the traffic off the Great Lakes. That was before the St. Lawrence Seaway and before all the locks and dams going down the Seaway, and take it down to either Boston or Portland or New York, depending on which company we were talking about, and get rich. Never much paid off, but the Rutland was one of the lines that managed through acquisitions and mergers to give it itself a line to Ogdensburg, which slightly survives to this day. The last 14 miles of the west end of it is actually still in place, although the rest, sadly, was part of the Island Line, and as we know, here in South Hero at least, is gone. There were multiple hubs, just like on the airlines. Depending again on which railroad you were talking about, the Boston and Maine had a big hub at Springfield, another one lesser at Greenfield, Max. The Boston and Maine and the Rutland hubbed at Bellows Falls. You add in the Canadian Pacific Railway to the equation at White River Junction. At Wells River, the Canadian Pacific and the Boston and Maine divided. And at Rutland, Vermont, as I mentioned earlier, the Rutland itself provided service. This entire complex of these multi-connecting trains all timed to meet each other and either provide through cars or simple cross-platform transfers, like something around in Switzerland, survived through the 1950s. Began to unravel with, not too surprisingly, the beginnings of the interstate highway system in the late 50s. The first line to exit would prove actually to be the Rutland. This is, first of all, I'm giving you a timetable page from the Boston and Maine Railroad timetable showing a variety of routes going up to Canada. If you look at this thing carefully, there's actually only 2 trains going straight through. They look like more because they had different times and different days of the week. But you can go either via Burlington or you can go via White River Junction and Wells River. 2 completely different routes. All of this still exists, except, amazingly, Boston, Concord, White River Junction, which sadly in the 1980s was torn up from Concord up to the outskirts of White River Junction, West Lebanon. And that's consequential later in this talk. But the service that people are always asking for is a direct train from Boston to Burlington. And in our time, it's not going to happen conveniently because most of what the route would be is now a bike path. The Rutland itself was the first to drop out. The Rutland did very well with passenger service during the Second World War. But after the war, as paved highways spread more and more, and as the milk business was lost, which was critical to the Rutland Railroad, the Rutland's passenger revenues began to alarmingly decline. And in the spring of 1953, the Rutland Railroad's employees went out on strike, a strange strike. They really weren't mad at the Rutland, but the National Railway Brotherhoods were insisting that every Class 1 railroad, and the Rutland was still theoretically a Class 1 railroad, would pay the exact same wage. And the Rutland's management refused to do that. They said, we're almost bankrupt, we can't afford it. And when the strike started, the Rutland arbitrarily canceled all passenger service as of that day, the 23rd of June, 1953. Now they did that completely illegally. In those days, to drop passenger service that across the state line required petitioning the Interstate Commerce Commission, public hearings. Rutland got away with it. Many years ago, Gardner Carverly, the president of Rutland at that time, gave a talk to our NRHS chapter and said, yeah, we knew it was illegal, but what are they going to do to us? Make us start running again and shut down in 3 days anyway, we ran out of money? I said we just bluffed them out and we got away with it. Sadly, a second strike, largely predicated on the same national wage level, killed the entire Rutland Railroad system in 1960, although it revived for a year and ran again into early part of 61 under court order. But that's not a story related to passenger service. So the first loss is ironically the line we just got back, the Rutland Railroad's mainline passenger service. Jumped a gun there, if I get back one. A little bit of examples of Rutland timetables and mapping. The Rutland never had streamlined equipment. One of our railroads up here that never got on board with the upgraded post-World War II streamlining of trains, but it ran a very reliable service. And at least 3 of the Rutland's ancient 19th century coaches still exist to this day, one on display down in Rutland. Here's an example of the main pages of the Rutland timetable. And if you look at the island line, Burlington out to Rouse's Point here, this is a 1937 timetable. We had 1, 2, this is the same train actually, Boston, New York, sections 3. We had 4 passenger trains a day out over the island.
Like, jeez.
1937. This is the height of the Depression. If you go back to the 1920s, there had been 6. But one of these is the milk train. The milk train goes all the way from Bellows Falls at 10:55 at night to Ogdensburg at 12:35 noon the next day, making every imaginable stop. Indeed, if you were wanting to go fishing, and the conductor knew what milepost you'd like to get off at, and you told him what day you were coming back, he'd put you off. And didn't have to worry too much about it. The milk train was actually, in some respects, however, the fastest train in the Rutland Railroad, because you had to get the milk to the creameries before it could spoil. So, although it made endless stops, and stayed quite a while at the stations while working the milk, then it went like a bat out of hell to the next stop. And there are reports of trains, particularly out here in the island, where the track was straight as an arrow and superbly engineered. The best built railroad ever built in the state of Vermont was the Island Line, and the first abandoned. Didn't make it even quite 60 years. But in any case, there are reports of trains out here on the Island Line going 70 to 80 miles an hour, which would have been pretty exciting probably. So we have some shots of the Island Line. The left picture is the milk train near the very end. The Rutland did buy diesels. On the right, more common image of the Rutland with steam engines. One Rutland Railroad diesel is still on the roster of the Vermont rail system to this day. And it's sort of their pride and joy. They run it from time to time, most commonly on passenger trains. There are 3 drawbridges like this on the Island Line, and they are, oddly enough, the probable primary reason why the Island Line wasn't saved. These drawbridges were all hand cranked. Guy actually spent the summer out there, and whenever a boat would approach, he would crank open the drawbridge and swing out. Incredibly out-of-date technology, but the cost of automating a single drawbridge, even back in the 60s, would have been the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the other problem with the Island Line, despite its magnificent engineering, was that local freight had pretty much disappeared out here, at least local freight that was going to go by rail. The mail business had been lost when the passenger trains were gone. The railway express business was lost with the passenger trains. The milk was all going off to trucks and to larger regional creameries. And there was ability to get freight from the south part of the state to Montreal by going from Burlington to Essex Junction and connecting to the central Vermont. And that didn't require maintaining all of these drawbridges. And particularly the very long bridge across the outlet of Lake Champlain over at Rouse's Point, a bridge that was in desperate need of renovation. And so the decision was made that if the one part of the Rutland system that wouldn't be preserved, it was the trackage north of Burlington. And sadly it was lost. I say sadly because we'll talk about later how, hindsight being infallible, we could really use this now. Central Vermont Network also included services from both Boston and New York, but the CV worked in conjunction with a train that started all the way in Washington, D.C., an overnight service called the Montreal or northbound Washingtonian southbound. And that train ran on the Canadian National, the Central Vermont, the New Haven and Hartford, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. 4 different railroads shared the train. No one had to change trains. Cars went right through. You just got a strip of tickets. The conductor would tear one off at a time as you went through junction points on the line. Day train, very nice also, but not quite as posh, was the Ambassador. Now, if you want to put it in context today, today's Vermonter is the Ambassador. The Ambassador originally was a Montreal-Boston train, but by the 1930s it also had coaches detached at White River Junction to New York. And ironically, it was the New York side of it that lasted to the end. The Boston service died off a couple of years earlier. But this was a good train. Until the Second World War, it had a full dining car and a parlor car, which was an elegant day car with sort of armchair seating. Later on, it had what the Pullman Company called a broiler buffet parlor car, which is half parlor and half a little dining car. The new station at Essex Junction, I tried to find a picture of the old station at Essex, but I couldn't turn up a good one. This little station on the left there is about to be completely rebuilt. Stranger projects are going to put a roof on top of the roof and extend out toward the track. There was originally an arched train shed here, as there was at St. Albans. It's about a block to the north. But this station opened in the 1950s. Graffiti vandals horribly vandalized it last year, but it's already had some work done. And there's a $4 million federal grant, one of Pat Leahy's last gifts to us, that's going to completely rebuild the Essex Junction station, which was until recently the most busy station in Vermont. It's now number 2. Burlington has surpassed it since Steve and Alan got to Burlington. The night train again was the Montrealer, a picture of her in the 1940s. This was its route. Notice there's a spur on this still going up to Bretton Woods. This is an example of a sleeping car line that ran only seasonally, but there was a sleeping car line that went up to the Mount Washington Hotel and to the Crawford House. And would take you directly from Philadelphia. The Philadelphia market was the centerpiece of the Mount Washington Hotel. Mount Washington catered to Philadelphia mainline money. And so there was a direct sleeper on the Montrealer, which was detached at Whitehaven Junction to get you up to the Mount Washington Hotel if you were coming up from Philly and you really needed to get back.
Did you transfer to the Cog Railway there?
There was actually track all the way out to Cog Station until about 1923, but they pulled it up then. It was a narrow gauge line. And when the tracks were standard gauge, they did not, for whatever reason, choose to keep intact the short piece up. Now this is the menu from the dining car that only operated between Whitehaven Junction and Montreal, and in later years just St. Albans to Montreal on the Montrealer, but you could get a very nice breakfast. After about 1951, this was replaced by a 6-bedroom lounge car, half lounge, half bedroom, but it had a little kitchen, a teeny little kitchen. If you look carefully at that menu, they can toast for you and they can make up an egg, or they can make up a turkey sandwich. One of those cars, a car called the Dover Harbor, still exists to this day and belongs to the Washington, D.C. chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. It is one of the most traveled privately owned railway cars in the United States. It has gone over 100,000 miles in the last decade around the U.S. I actually chartered it once to bring a Smithsonian tour up here. Still very much in service. It's been exquisitely restored with even reproduction of the carpeting that was used in the 1930s. It's a remarkable piece of restoration. These trains made it into the 60s, and I want you to look at the little footnote up at the top about ridership at the end. It came off at the end of the summer, Labor Day weekend in '66, primarily because the mail contracts were going to be lost. And for trains before Amtrak, the difference between profit and loss was often not so much ridership as it was the United States Mail, which provided a huge subsidy to passenger operations. But the two trains combined, in their last full year of operation, carried 94,535 riders. Now, just to put that sort of in context, because people say, well, you know, nobody takes the train anymore. So I want you to just sort of note that figure. The Montrealer was the first permanent, in quotes, restored route under Amtrak. There had briefly been a restoration of service to Cleveland, Ohio, and there was an experimental route running from St. Paul to Spokane, Washington through Missoula. But in 1972, the federal government said that there would be a new route from New York to Montreal. Everybody assumed it would go up through New York State, because the Delaware and Hudson Railroad on the far side of Lake Champlain had never lost interest in passenger service, and right up to Amtrak Day was running both a day and a night train. The night train had 4 sleepers on it at the very end. It was still being well patronized. Everybody assumed it would be the D&H, including D&H management, which actually renovated their passenger cars in anticipation of the service, but we got it. Even then, in the 90s, our congressional delegation was more powerful than the New York one, and we got the train. This was its first dining car menu, which is pretty nice. Raised sirloin steak for $4.75 was the price high. You get a filet of sauteed sole for $2.70, or $2.20, pardon me, and a ham steak for $2.70. The Montrealer, as restored, was actually, by Amtrak, was actually much more posh than it had been for 40 years under the Central Vermont. The diner, again, had vanished in 1951. This went right through to Washington. Later, it became a half diner, half lounge car. There was a piano at one end of the car. They paid an entertainer to play all on the night. As long as anybody was drinking, he was there playing. Didn't last too many years, but this is a menu from that dining car period when they had the player piano. They called it the Le Pub car. And if you look carefully at this menu is in French and English, which was also something that Amtrak did, which the predecessor railroads and private railroads had never done. However, there were problems that were not obvious to a rider looking at the strong loads on the train. It typically had 4 coaches, a diner, and 4 sleepers every night, and for quite a while, 2 slumber coaches, which was coach ticket sleeper also. But the Boston and Maine Corporation no longer really wanted to maintain the line from Whitegar Junction down to Springfield to passenger train standards. They felt that they could run a freight train at 10 miles an hour and that would be good enough. And so, although they were contractually and legally obligated to maintain the track to the standard it was in 1971 when Amtrak began, the B&M simply refused to do it. The track got so bad between Windsor and Brattleboro that all of the passing tracks were closed, but the north and southbound trains had to pass each other in that stretch. But think about that, you know right away, one or the other is going to be extremely late because it's going to have to wait while the other train comes up through about 50 miles of track. Ultimately, the Montrealers were running 3 to 4 hours late every day in New York and Montreal, which was not sustainable. And Amtrak suspended the train to negotiate repairs to the track, which the Boston and Maine refused to do. And another of our distinctions, we are the only route in the history of Amtrak in which Amtrak ever asserted its legal right to actually seize a railroad line from the private freight company that owned it, if the private freight company refused to maintain safe track for passenger traffic. $5 million appropriation acquired by then Congressman Sanders, Senator Jeffords, and Senator Leahy. We got $5 million. We took the track over, resold it a day later, 24 hours later, to the Central Vermont for $1 million. Granted the Boston and Maine 75 years of access for their freight trains for about $70,000 a year, one of the deals of the century, and rebuilt the line. A little over 2 years later, the train came back, but in the interim, it was just a bus. Close to a 5-hour-long bus ride, wasn't very popular. They made no attempt with the bus acquisition to serve Montreal. This was a real problem. The train was restored, but it never was quite the same. The train came back in '89, and its ridership had been undermined by being gone completely for 2 years. It had a reputation for running late. And even after the track was fixed, there still were problems with on-time performance because the track between New Haven and Springfield was getting dicey. And ultimately, Amtrak management decided that it could no longer sustain the Montrealer and announced that service would end in the spring of 1995. At that time, I was sitting on the board of the National Association of Railroad Passengers, as well as running my tour company, Rail Travel Center. And our offices were actually in the General Office Building, the CV at St. Albans, what had been part of the magnificent station up there in St. Albans. And I wrote a proposal to the then Dean administration, to Governor Dean and to Pat Garahan, who was the Secretary of Transportation, suggesting that while the Montrealer was costing Amtrak $4 million a year, if we switched from running an overnight sleeping car service to running a day train, we could do it for a lot less money because we wouldn't need sleepers with porters, we wouldn't need a diner with chefs, we could run a much more economical operation. And to my amazement, the Dean administration bid on it. Negotiations went on for about 5 months with Amtrak, but we got the train. This is some newspaper coverage I got at the time. On the left was the schedule proposal that I sent up to Pat Garahan at the AOT. And on the right, I got a chance to run an op-ed. This is when the Burlington Free Press still ran gasp editorials. If you read what's left of it, there isn't even an editorial itself, not to mention op-eds anymore. But I think there's only 4 reporters literally left in the newsroom also, so not too surprising. But I had a lot more hair in 1994 than I do now. That was darker colored. But I've spent almost 50 years advocating for passenger rail service in the United States, and this is my one great signal success. We got the train. Governor Dean's basic position was, if you can get this for us for at or under $1 million a year, we'll do it. And at least the first year, 1995, we got it for $700,000. Now we pay about $7 million, but we do get 2 trains out of that. We get a lot more service and use from it, but this is my great thank you from Pat Leahy. The senator came into my office in St. Albans and dropped off this wonderful framed poster. Unfortunately, his staff had failed to check to make sure that I was going to be there. I was actually in Switzerland that day. I've never ceased being mortified by this, although I have apologized to the senator face-to-face on more than one occasion. But this is my one treasured memento of that. My wife, thank God, was there, as was the rest of my staff, but I was in Zurich that morning. This is the first schedule of the restored service, which unfortunately, because of expense, was a bus north of St. Albans, which lasted for about 8 years until Vermont Transit discontinued the route that went in the early morning from Burlington up to Montreal and back. And we now, unfortunately, the train goes only as far as St. Albans, so we're working again on trying to get the train itself to Montreal. Why was it a bus? One of the reasons that killed the Montrealer was that Amtrak crews could not go beyond St. Albans in those days. And the labor rules required the use of 3 crews a day for a 2-hour-long run from Montreal to St. Albans. One Canadian National crew took the train down to St. Albans, spent the day in a hotel in St. Albans overnight, went back the next morning. Doesn't sound too bad. Problem was, a second crew was responsible for turning the train around in the yards in Montreal, and another one for bringing it back. Bottom line is taking 3 crews a day to make a 2-hour-long run because of essentially, I'm saying it was a pro-union guy, but a ridiculous featherbedding. Today, Amtrak would be able to run through to Montreal, and that's critical of the possibility of potentially getting back up there. But it wasn't true in '95. So this is the route of the replacement service, and except for not going across the border, of course, it's identical to what the Montrealer did. And in that respect, it's not identical to the Ambassador, because the Ambassador went to Grand Central Station in New York. And if you know New York railroad stations, Grand Central is actually a terminal. Proper name of it is GCT, Grand Central Terminal, which means the tracks end there. Whereas Pennsylvania Station is a through station. You go through a tunnel under the East River, Penn Station in the middle of Manhattan Island, they go another tunnel under the Hudson and on to Washington. So by switching the terminal in New York to Penn Station, we were able to extend the train directly through to Washington, D.C. Something the day service had never done before. Train still runs over a variety of railroads, but today Amtrak is able to operate its own services on all of the freight railroads, paying a toll like it was on a toll thruway. But after Springfield, the track actually belongs to Amtrak, and actually after the Vermont state line, the track belongs to Massachusetts Commonwealth to Springfield. So in effect, it's actually a government operation after East Northfield, Vermont, going across the High Bridge, down in New Hampshire just before Claremont. That's the highest bridge on the line. So this is a Vermonter timetable from more recently when we had straightened out the route a bit. Initially to get through, because the track was still in pathetic condition from the Vermont state line down to Springfield on the old Boston, Maine, the Vermonter took the central Vermont route to Palmer, Mass, and then went over to Springfield. Now that line had not had a passenger train on since 1949. The Vermonter started in 1996. Another long absence getting it back. Only one stop was ever made in that district at Amherst, Mass. But there was a problem at Palmer. First problem was you had to hand throw 6 switches to get onto the Boston to Albany to go to Springfield. The other was the track at Palmer aimed at Boston, but the train was going to New York. So they had to have engines on both ends of the train, or they had to have a cab control car at one end, and the crew had to walk around to the other end and continue. Bottom line is it took half an hour to get through Palmer, even though the train never went by the station and actually picked anybody up there. By getting rid of that, ultimately, we finally got rid of that about 5 years ago, we instantly took 45 minutes out of the running time of the train. Because it's shorter down through Holyoke and Northampton, and no more of that nonsense about reversing direction. So this is part of a project called the Knowledge Corridor, which was actually a concept created by a gentleman at V-Trans. The idea being with all those colleges down there that you could have a fairly intensive regional service of passenger trains down through the area of the four colleges, and it would do well. Amherst had been the strongest station in Massachusetts, but just for whatever it's worth, the stop now at Northampton is drawing 4 times the business Amherst did. And lots of UMass students and Amherst College kids are still either taking a local bus or driving over. It's only 8 miles over to Northampton. Ridership really exploded when it went from Amherst to Northampton. Now, remember that 94,000 figure? This is the ridership alone for the Vermonter only, just for the one train. In 2019, the last year, things were completely normal. And we hit 98,168 just of the day train. Whereas the 2 trains combined back in the 1960s were only doing 94,000 riders a year. And this doesn't count the Ethan Allen Express, which at this time was running only as far as Rutland. It's interesting what's happened in the United States in the last 25 or 30 years. When Amtrak started in 1971, it was lucky to have about 8 million riders. Again, just before the pandemic, it was up to 31 million. If it had been an airline, it would have been the 7th largest airline actually in the United States. Sort of flying under the radar, but, and the ridership is not all like us in this room, which is to say it's not all elderly people who remember trains when they were really good. It's actually predominantly today young people who are inclined to go by public transit, among other reasons, for environmental concerns. There are still many, many problems that dog Amtrak, including really ancient equipment, lack of maintenance funds, insufficient willingness to take risks on behalf of its own management. But ridership has been an extraordinary success story. And although the Vermonter, of course, didn't run at all for 2 years during the pandemic, its ridership after being restored, fairly remarkable as well. The ridership, the Vermonter came back in July of 2021 and was back up to 89% of its former ridership by April of this year. But to carry this story forward, by October, the Vermonter was up to 101% of its former ridership, and that was in addition to, or in direct face of competition in Northern Vermont from the Ethan Allen Express, which had also disappeared for the 2 years of the peak of the pandemic, but by April of this year was doing 116% of its pre-pandemic business, and that was before the extension to Burlington. This is a really quite amazing, actually, what's been happening sort of quietly and under the radar with these trains. So is Montreal next? I'll answer my own question, I hope so. We are 55 miles from 4 million people, many of whom like to come down here to Vermont, particularly on weekends in the summer, but like to come down here to Vermont. And it is, in my opinion, ridiculous that we don't serve them. This was the very last Montrealer across the Missisquoi Bay Bridge, and I took that picture in 1995. There are problems, though, with getting back to Montreal. I mentioned that constantly when I was in business, people called about Boston to Montreal. And they'd get off in Concord, or would stop over in Manchester on the way down. Problem being, again, that the state of New Hampshire, unfortunately, allowed the Boston and Maine to tear up the rail between West Lebanon and Concord in exchange for granting the right-of-way unambiguous to the state of New Hampshire to put a bike path on it. Now, could it be put back? Yeah, sure. But at staggering expense, and there is unfortunately no history of a major 60-mile long line in the U.S. ever being restored to service. So the way the federal government is now talking about Boston-Montreal is Boston-Springfield-Montreal. But even if you were to upgrade Boston to Springfield, which as you can see is actually pretty twisty, to say 110 miles an hour, which is as fast as you can go without obliterating every grade crossing under U.S. safety rules, you'd still have about an 11-hour run from Boston to Montreal, and you can drive at 4.5 to 5. So sadly, we probably are not going to see a practical northern Vermont to Boston service anytime soon. But Massachusetts is intensely interested in upgrading this line for internal Commonwealth traffic, and from White River Junction, or from the existing point where the Knowledge Corridor train started in Greenfield to Boston, actually the times are quite competitive. They're looking at taking track conditions up from what presently is a 60-mile-an-hour road, initially to 80, and then hopefully in a few years to 110, although that starts meeting some pretty serious tunnels in western Mass. But it's more than possible that might actually happen. The yellow dotted line, again, would have been the ideal way to do it. You really wanted high-speed rail from Boston to Montreal. And if there was really a serious commitment to do high-speed rail, which means more than 110 miles an hour, European means 198 miles an hour, what you're actually talking about is an entirely new railroad. None of the infrastructure up here in northern Vermont, ironically with the possible exception of the Rutland, was ever very straight. Everything curved around the rivers and followed the contours of the mountains and didn't tunnel under long tunnels, just short ones. But the bottom line is you can't upgrade a twisty, turning line along the Ashuelot River or along the Connecticut or whatever to run at 110 miles an hour. You didn't build an entirely new railroad. But I doubt strongly that the willpower is there in the U.S. to do it. And in particular, and realistically, in a stretch from Boston to Montreal, there's only one or two places of any population consequence, Manchester in New Hampshire, Burlington up here. It just wouldn't be justifiable at really high speed levels. But that doesn't mean we couldn't have back the Montrealer or the Ambassador or the Vermonter. This was a test train that Vermont ran up to Montreal about 6 years ago. We've been talking about this for a long time. This test train got from St. Albans to Montreal in about 2.5 hours, no operational problems whatsoever. The bridge here is the bridge over the Richelieu River up near Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, and this drawbridge needs to be automated, which is probably a $4 or $5 million project. The track beyond it up to the outskirts of Montreal has recently been dropped to 10 miles an hour by the Canadian National. But historically, it was a 60-mile-an-hour railroad. All the infrastructure is there. You simply need to do tie work, ballasting, surfacing. It's not a whole new railroad. Negotiations are underway. They have been underway for close to 10 years. The customs authorities of both the United States and Canada are no longer willing to provide inspection of the border. They want to do it in Central Station in Montreal, which is actually a great idea. It's the way they do it in Vancouver. The train could go right through. They wouldn't have to sit at the border for an hour and a half like the Adirondack does over at Rouse's Point every day while customs is conducted. But we've now had 3 different designs done for the holding facility in Montreal. What happens is the Quebec government changes, the new government wants to do it all over again. This has happened 3 times. We're now on the 4th design of the customs facility in Montreal, and only now, after all of these years, has it finally occurred to the operating authorities in both countries that it's all fine and good to have a customs facility in Central Station, which, by the way, took a treaty between the U.S. and Canada, a treaty that Pat Leahy primarily pushed through. It's fine and good to have this brand new facility in Central Station, but how do you get there if the track's down to 10 miles an hour? It would take 6 hours from St. Albans to Montreal, which obviously no one would ride, no one would use. It's absurd. We probably are looking at a $20 to $30 million project to go 60 and a bit more to go faster. And that may sound daunting, but actually in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there is a pot of money already appropriated. 5 years of funds were appropriated in that for reconstruction of Amtrak lines across the border in Canada. And so if we can get a deal, it's doable. But it is complex. We have the Vermont Department of Transportation. New York is involved because the Adirondack hasn't been running to Montreal since the pandemic either. The Ministry of Transport of the province of Quebec. The Ministry of Transport of the country of Canada. The Canadian National Railway. Amtrak. They all have to agree. And the US DOT, of course, which would actually provide the money. Keep working on it. Went the wrong way on me for some strange reason. There we go. So how do we get from Burlington to Montreal if we can't go up the island line? And the answer is this little branch line that follows the Winooski River Canyon through Colchester and Winooski, 8 miles of track, 10-mile-an-hour railroad again, so it's all made for freight trains, but actually in remarkably good condition. About half of it has heavy welded rail on it. It was extensively rebuilt during the construction of a tunnel down in Middlebury 3 years ago. If that little branch line was upgraded to 30-mile-an-hour operating standards, a passenger train could get from Burlington to Essex Junction in about 15 minutes. You'll never go much faster than that because if you've seen it ever, it's in a really narrow slot canyon along the Winooski River coming out of downtown Winooski. And if a train went through there at 60 miles an hour, it'd be in the canyon, literally down in the river. So that train is never going to be fast, but it does have the possibility. It serves 40th and Allen, it serves the college out there, it serves downtown Winooski. It also could be used for local commuter trains. And this is, of course, the way freight Post the Allen line gets from southern Vermont to Montreal, if it's come up through Rutland and Middlebury, is it changes from the Vermont rail system, which today operates the Rutland, to the New England Central, which today operates what was the Central Vermont Railway, and they go on to Montreal. The upgrading of that line is in the long-term Vermont rail plan for the next 5 years, although it is not the highest of priorities. I personally have been pressing VTrans for the last decade to move the priority of it up. It's a really simple project, actually. It's basically a lot of ties, a bit of rail, a bunch of ballast, and something railroaders call surfacing, which is to make sure all that stuff is smooth. But it would be one work season to do it, and if you did do it, we have now got a 60-mile-an-hour passenger railway here, another one here, and there's only 8 miles of track separating them. If you fix this, not only could we have trains directly to Montreal from Burlington, but we could have trains, for example, from Barrie and Montpelier to Burlington and on to Middlebury. We could have trains from St. Albans that would go to Burlington and Middlebury. We could have trains from Barrie itself that might go to New York. A lot of interesting possibilities would open up. All of this track is usable, except the part from Essex to Burlington is too slow to realistically operate a passenger train. Santa trains go on occasionally, but the kids meeting Santa don't mind if the train goes 10 miles an hour. So this was an example of the Vermont Agency of Transportation's work plan about 4 years ago. And notice the big project here this year was 35 miles of jointed rail remaining between Burlington and Rutland needed to be replaced with welded rail. Historically, the railroads had a joint every 40 feet in the rail. That's how the clickety-clack, 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 your wheels would go to the joint. That required a lot of maintenance to keep smooth track. Frost heaving, water, rain, snow. Railroads traditionally had section crews about every 10 miles along the line, and what they did was to keep that track smooth and safe. But with the decline of passenger service in particular, those districts started stretching out. Today, a railroad would typically, Burlington and Rutland, be one section. And if it was all jointed rail, it'd be pretty bumpy if you tried to run through it at 60 miles an hour with a passenger train. So, although it took about a decade to do it, little by little, VTrans has rebuilt the former Rutland Railroad main line to a standard of excellence that it never had in its history. Right now, everything is done from Rutland to Burlington. It's all brand new welded rail. It's got a 60-mile-an-hour speed limit on it, which doesn't sound that fast, but that's because it has no signals. No block signals on it. If we installed signals, the speed limit could instantly be raised to 80 miles an hour. Instantly, except on curves. If we put in cab signaling, what's called positive train control, which would stop the train if it ran through a signal and didn't observe it, we could instantly raise the speed limit on tangent track, straight track, to 90 miles an hour. The same comment applies to the central Vermont coming out of White River Junction. South of White River Junction, the central Vermont had signals, at least as far as Brattleboro, and still does. In fact, last summer they added signals from Brattleboro to the Mass State line, and they were also always in place from Springfield to the Mass State line. So now we've got a signal system, and we have 79 miles per hour on tangent track from White River Junction down to Springfield. South of Springfield, the Vermonter can go 110 to New Haven. From New Haven to New York, it can go 79 to the outskirts of New York, and then as it approaches the Hellgate Bridge, 110. After New York, the Vermonter can and does every day go 125 miles an hour from New York to Washington. So our Vermont train up here is not exactly dawdling the whole way down the line, but we have an opportunity up here at relatively imaginable cost to take the next step in upgrading these routes for higher standards of passenger service in particular, if we put in block signals, and of course that also dramatically enhances safety. And there is money in the bipartisan infrastructure law to do exactly that. And doing that kind of work is, again, in the longer-term Vermont rail plan, but once again, not in like next year's work. Next year, they're going to push the welded rail to Bennington and Hoosick, New York. The whole Rutland main line, north-south, then would have welded rail on it. And they're working on the line from Rutland over to Bellows Falls, which actually carries a tremendous amount of freight today. But that's never going to be super high speed, because that could be right over the top of the Green Mountains and long sustained grades. But they're working on that. And those projects are going to probably take the next 2 to 3 years. And Montreal comes ahead of what I've been talking about, but we've got all kinds of good stuff to do up here in Vermont. And the business is following the stuff we have to do. We started on Jim Jeffords' initiative, a second route in 1996, the Ethan Allen Express, initially just from Rutland to New York. And we worked basically from 96 to this year to get it up to Burlington. And for a whole variety of reasons, for years the money never quite came through, or it got diverted to other projects. But finally, starting about 6 years ago, V-Trans got really serious about this and got the job done. These are some pictures of the train down at Rutland, but now it doesn't terminate at Rutland, now it goes all the way to Burlington. This was the initial timetable for it. And here's an example of what I mean about if you could do a little bit of work, you could go a lot faster. Burlington to Rutland, 2 hours, with 3 stops, Vergennes, Middlebury, and Rutland. The 1937 Rutland Railroad timetable that I showed you had the crack day train, the Green Mountain Flyer, going Burlington to Rutland in 1 hour and 47 minutes with 7 stops. We do actually expect to take 20 minutes out of this schedule sometime this year. But we're doing a land office business with a train that doesn't go very fast. It needs to improve its running times to New York. These are some pictures of the work that the state of Vermont V-Trans did to prepare for the train. This is the historic Vergennes station from 1859. Which was actually moved about a half-mile up the track, right to the Vergennes-Ferrisburg town line and rebuilt. Exquisite rebuilding. And it's a now multimodal rail station. Not just rail and car, but rail and bus. It's integrated with intercity buses and with regional buses. This is Burlington Union Station as it was before its closure in 1953 as an active passenger station. But remarkably, it was not only never torn down, a lot of the interior survived, albeit behind various partitions. And a group calling itself Main Street Landing, headed up in part by a friend of mine named Melinda Bolton, actually began an extensive redevelopment of the Union Station. This is on the street level up where Main Street terminates. You see it's the old marble newsstand still there. Behind these walls, if you ever get permission to pull on a few offices, most of the main waiting room with its gorgeous marble interior is still there. But Melinda and her group down on the lower level of the station constructed this entirely new concourse where the baggage and mail facility used to be. And although it is new, it's quite spectacular, sort of modern industrial chic. I love the gargoyles on top of the station. They weren't there when it was Rutland. Melinda has an addict sense of humor regarding art, and she had gargoyles put on the station, but they guarded it, keep the evil spirits away. This is the grand approach out to the platform that you follow. This is the view terrace. While you're waiting for the train, you go up this terrace and look out over Lake Champlain, watch the boats sailing. New Amtrak guests. This is the new concourse at track level. This was entirely created of what again was once mail and express loading facilities. Truly spectacular. 1913 building. Passenger service ended in 1953. It did return briefly for commuters for a 2-year experiment about the year 2000, but returned seriously in 2022. And this is the first train in 69 years backing into the station. On the 22nd, wild horses would have kept me away from this. Bernie Sanders speaking. Really, this should have been Jim Jeffords, but obviously Senator Jeffords had passed. Bernie has always been a passionate supporter of rail. It's not a shot at Bernie, but the man who probably more than anybody else, Jim Jeffords and Pat Leahy, actually did the most for us. Pat was recovering from his fall and couldn't come to this, but Howard Dean was here. He's the other one. Dean took the chance as governor to be the smallest state in the United States to sponsor passenger rail services. The first train departing on Thanksgiving Saturday, the Saturday prior to Thanksgiving, which is the beginning of what normally is the busiest week of the year for passenger trains. The Ethan Allen boarded 239 passengers at Burlington The capacity of the train is only 280. The average loadings at Burlington are in the 60 to 70 range, but we've had several days where it passed 150. And again, on the Saturday prior to Thanksgiving this year, we picked up 239 people in Burlington. So here's the October figures. Amtrak has been very slow releasing November and December, but by October, the Ethan Allen Express was 81% ahead of where it was in 2019. Perhaps not too surprising since it had by then been extended to Burlington. The Vermonter, only a 1% gain on 2019, but what that actually means is that's an all-time record for a month of ridership on the Vermonter. It's 101% of peak fall foliage ridership. And one of the things we were concerned about is that if the Ethan Allen got to Burlington, it would severely hurt the Vermonter because it would be drawing from the same market. And it's almost 2 hours faster to New York. More direct route. Despite that slow run down to Rutland, it's got a very direct route down to New York. After Schenectady, it too could run at over 100 miles an hour. But that hasn't happened. In fact, what seems to be happening is ridership at Essex Junction is down about 5%, but stops down the line where the Vermonter was typically sold out in motor car business class. Now there's space available and people are boarding it. That day when the 239 got on down at Burlington Union Station, the Vermonter picked up a respectable 157 people out at Essex Junction, which is still pretty good. And that combined, of course, is close to 400 riders that day on Northern Vermont. So, the timetable again, this is to talk a little bit about coordinated rail bus service. In most of Europe, it goes without saying that if a railway line doesn't go to your village, there'll be a bus from a nearby train station that will directly take you to the village. And out in California, Amtrak runs a vast network of buses out of a place called Bakersfield to almost every point in Southern California, connecting with its trains down the San Joaquin Valley. And even here in Vermont, we now have 2 trips a day from Burlington down to Albany by bus, in addition to the train, at different times of the day. A bus very early in the morning, which can get you to New York in time to actually do an afternoon of business in New York. A bus late in the afternoon out of Burlington, which will get you to Albany in time to catch the Lakeshore Limited to Chicago, and then Ethan Allen in the middle. But those are the only examples of coordinated bus service in Vermont. And yet the state of Vermont provides one of the most extensive state-sponsored bus systems actually in the United States, if you take into account the overall size of this state. Now, those of us who are advocates for the rail service produced this timetable to try to show people the integrated service. When you get south of Burlington, you've got bus and rail. But one of the absurdities is Vermont is paying for all 3 of these services. The train, of course, serves the railroad station in Burlington, but the buses don't. Even though the buses go to the railroad station in Albany and exist to feed people into Amtrak. This is ludicrous. We've been working on it for almost 2 years to try to get this fixed, and we can't get it done. There's too many chiefs and not enough Indians. We keep working on it, but almost every day somebody shows up at the wrong station and misses either the train or the bus because they get confused about the station codes. They go in to book it. The obvious fix is the buses go to the bloody railroad station. I actually rode back from Rutland on the first day of the train. I took the bus back to avoid sitting in Rutland for 5 or 6 hours. And we went within 1 block of Union Station, but we didn't stop. There's things still to work on. So here's an example of how you're supposed to do this. The most successful new passenger service in the eastern United States, and arguably the most successful new service in Amtrak's history, is not our 2 trains. It is the Downeaster from Boston up to Portland and Brunswick and soon Rockland, Maine. This also had been gone for decades. Boston and Maine managed to withdraw the last passenger services to Boston, Portland in 1961. It came back in 2000 after decades of work. Initially with 4 trains a day, now there's 5. This route had a history of snazzy trains. At the height of the Depression, the Boston and Maine brought a small but dedicated streamliner from the Budd Corporation and named it the Flying Yankee, replaced a steam train with the same name. This routinely ran at 110 miles an hour from Boston up to Portland. It ran Boston-Portland in 2 hours flat. We do 230 a day, although we make a bunch of stops, which the Flying Yankee didn't. This train, ironically, kind of put itself out of business. It was so unbelievably successful that it came up with a crunch. It was not designed to add cars. It was a fixed consist train. You couldn't put another car on it if it got busy. You had to add another train instead. And the Boston and Maine ended up, in later years, running this train from Boston up to the Mount Washington Hotel as the Mountaineer, from Boston over to Troy, New York, as the Minuteman. It's still in existence. It's actually up in the area, the south end of Franconia and Notch today, under a bunch of tarps, supposedly being restored, but it's been under those tarps for about a decade. Here's an example from the early 1950s of the Boston to Portland timetable. There were a lot of trains. And there were, actually, if you read this very carefully, there's a couple of buses integrated with trains in this. Saturday, here's a Sunday bus in connection with a train. And this is, again, not rocket science. This is normal in most of the world, but almost unheard of in the United States. Bus companies, the road companies hated each other. They didn't cooperate, and unfortunately, the tradition went down through the years. After the Flying Yankee kind of put itself out of business, the Boston and Maine on the left bought a whole fleet of beautiful brand new streamlined passenger cars after World War II, upgraded all the services up to Maine. They had fine dining car service on it, really nice. But by 1955, the Maine Turnpike and the New Hampshire Turnpike had opened, and although they didn't take all the traffic away, they made the difference between profit and loss. They sucked enough away that the Boston and Maine began cutbacks. First they tried this Spanish tilting train called the Talgo. It made one big festive trip from Boston to Portland with all the politicians on board, and it vibrated so violently while doing it over the crappy jointed rail of the Boston and Maine Railroad that it never went to Portland again. They put it into commuter service out of Boston and wore it out about a decade ago. Now these, I shouldn't put Talgo trains down. Amtrak ran a fleet of the Pacific Northwest for decades, and they're very common in Europe, but you have to have well-maintained track. They tilt around the curves, and one car shares a truck with the one behind it, and they don't like crappy track. Instead, the Boston and Maine bought the largest fleet in the world of self-propelled rail diesel cars, built by the Budd Company, the same company that built the Flying Yankee. B&M at its peak owned over 100 of these, 109 of these cars. Not only were all of the intercity trains except the Ambassador and the Montrealer replaced with these, but they ran all the commuter train services around Boston. And one of the things that was clever about these cars is each car was fully powered and had a cab in it. So a three-car train like this could split at Whitehorse Junction. This car could go to Berlin, these two could go to Montreal. And it made it very efficient and easy to run secondary routes. The theory of the Budd car was that it would reduce dramatically fuel use and reduce dramatically the cost of maintenance, and could be run by a smaller crew. All true, but in most cases, the railroads could not convince the unions to let them run the smaller crew. You still had the traditional five-man crew, conductor, assistant conductor, head-end brakeman, rear-end brakeman, engineer, and for one car, that was crazy. This is the first example of a Downeaster schedule. This is the train-only portion of it. But this is what you get when you get to Portland. You get a series of coordinated bus connections. And these can all be ticketed by Amtrak as if it was the train. Now initially the train went only as far as Portland, but in 2017 it was extended to run to Brunswick. And again, very shortly, hopefully there's going to be service to Rutland. Now this runs 5 round trips a day. I'm very proud of the fact that we're going to pass 100,000 riders next year, I'm confident, on both trains. But the Downeaster's carrying 535,000 riders before the pandemic. And perhaps a better comparison is we're getting 2 trains for between $7 and $8 million. Maine's getting 5 trains for about 11 million. Because ridership follows frequency. You can serve more markets if you run more trains. And with only 1 train, as we have, and both with a daylight train, even though I'm the father of the Vermonter, I will freely explain that it has a terrible problem. If you want to go to Montreal or New York on it, you need 2 nights in a hotel to have any time to do anything. If you're going to Vermont, it's great. You're probably going back for the day, no problem. But if you're a Vermonter and you want to go to New York, you get in at 6:30 in the evening, the train leaves at 11:35 the next morning, you're going to do anything in New York, you need 2 nights in a New York hotel. If we had a second train, a second frequency, not killing the Vermonter, but a second train, adapted to business travelers like the Montrealer was, you would have gotten to New York or Montreal around 9 o'clock in the morning, come back out around 8 o'clock in the evening, you'd have a day in New York, and no need for a hotel. And that's how multiple frequencies make it easier for people to use the services. They get 5 times our ridership for only about 80% more funding than we get for one train. And, it's, frequency, patronage follows. For about 10 years, there actually was passenger train service from Brunswick up to Rutland on the old Maine Central coastline. But it did not connect anything on Amtrak, oddly enough. It just ran for local tourist business. There was a change in the subcontractor of the Maine Department of Transportation running the branch, and these trains stopped running. But they're going to start again this summer using RDC cars, using those Bud cars. They're still around. A gentleman named David Blittersdorf here in Vermont bought a fleet of second-hand RDC cars from the Commuter Rail Authority down in Dallas, Texas. David trusted that they would be run up here in Vermont to do regional services like I talked about Barrie to Burlington, but he's not so far at least convinced the present administration of V-Trans to do that. But he has leased several cars to the new operator of this branch line, and they're going to run a service properly coordinated with Amtrak on weekends next summer, and hopefully actually all week long as well. There will be a need to change trains once at Brunswick, but then you'll be able to go on to Damariscotta, to Bath, to Wiscasset, and to Rutland on a Bud car. Same type of equipment exactly that Boston Maine used back all those years ago. Now, ridership has exploded up here and even further south. This is the new schedule as it was proposed. Actually, it's long since been operating. They're running even more trains than you see here. From Springfield down to New Haven, the state of Connecticut is now helping to support. Amtrak was running 6 trains a day. They're now running 16.
Wow.
And before the pandemic struck, they were up around 800,000 riders. This is the new coordinated schedule of the Vermonter, but also those Valley Fire trains I mentioned from Greenfield down to New Haven. These, if they ever get in Massachusetts a decent morning train into Boston out of Springfield, could easily provide a cross-platform transfer at Springfield to Boston. Indeed, if one of these trains originated in New Haven, it could go to Haven, Hartford, Boston as well. But so far there's only, it looks like 3 trains here, but notice this is Saturday and Sunday schedule, these are Monday through Friday. But they're now morning trains out of Greenfield at least that will get you into New York by as early as 10:22 in the morning and enable you to do a day of work in New York. Hurt the Vermonter? No. All 3 are doing fine. It's more frequency, you get more patronage. We, however, do not pay anything for these trains because they do not cross over into Vermont. Negotiations are underway on a low-key level, but they're alive, to have one of these trains start probably initially in Brattleboro, but I'm pushing for it to start in White River Junction. That would give people in southern Vermont an early morning trip to New York option. And again, if Mass gets a morning train to Boston, also potentially to Boston. While it is unlikely that anybody would want to ride from 9:45 in the morning out of Essex Junction to 7:30 at night down to Boston, they might very well be willing to do it from White River Junction if it was 2 to 3 hours faster than that. But this is the timetable now on the Vermonter route, including the service at South Border. And here's examples of the Bud cars I was talking about. So the interior of one of the ones actually from Via Rail Canada. Mr. Blittersdorf is very interested again in expanding services. So here's some possibilities. What about morning service from Springfield to Boston? Actually, the Commonwealth is now talking about as many as 8 trains a day from Springfield to Boston. But even a single early morning trip would be of great use to Western Mass. There is an Amtrak train from Springfield to Boston, but it leaves Springfield at 5 o'clock at night, gets to Boston at 9. Once again, you do it much faster on a bus. It's not practical, and it's coming from Chicago, so it's often quite late. And it's only 1 a day. Lakeshore Limited. Amtrak did try one very interesting new experimental service this summer that did quite well, surprisingly, and that was New York to Pittsfield via Albany, putting a train back into the Berkshires in the summer. Only went up Friday and back Sunday, but they actually did remarkably well with ridership on it, and will be back this year. Now, Bud cars, again, this is the interchange at White River Junction between the Canadian Pacific, the Boston and Maine, and the Central Vermont, 3 trains in at once in Waterbury Junction back in the 50s with perfectly coordinated connections. But diesel self-propelled rail cars are actually very common in most of the world, and this is an example of one down in Texas called the A-Train. Texas has gone from having almost no rail service to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, at least, having 4 different rail networks, heavy rail, and a massive network of light rail lines. This is a Swiss-designed, modern example of a rail diesel car, built by the Stadler Company in Switzerland. Now people say, well, these cars could never make it through the winter. This is the interior of British Columbia, the mountains of BC. If you're addicted to watching the Highway to Hell programs, it's a bit further up the Highway to Hell, where the British Columbia Railway had a magnificent crossing into the Fraser River Canyon along Anderson and Seton Lakes. For decades, they ran a bud car train on this line, 12 months of the year, with 98% reliability of the equipment. Boston and Maine itself ran an extensive network of RDC cars from Boston over to Troy and Albany as late as 1958. This is the new TexRail line that goes from Fort Worth out to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. I got a chance to ride this last November. I took these pictures. It's not the lack of ridership. They let me get on about 20 minutes before the train left to take some pictures at Fort Worth. But this is the interior of one of these new Swiss-built rail cars that's running down the Dallas area. Even some of our tourist roads could potentially be integrated into the Sirius network. I talked about the plans up in Maine to offer a service from Brunswick to Rutland. This was at Saratoga Springs about 6 years ago. There was for a while a Vista Dome streamliner went from Saratoga Springs up to North Creek, New York on the old Delaware and Hudson North Creek branch. Sadly, the service didn't succeed because it wasn't well enough coordinated with Amtrak. Same station, but you had to lay over for hours and hours. Americans don't like that. The Green Mountain Railroad, until fairly recently, a subsidiary of the Vermont Rail System, ran a tourist train every summer out of Bellows Falls up to Chester. This is it going under the Interstate Highway Bridge. The Vermonter route intersects with it at Rockingham, Bellows Falls Station. Trains were never coordinated, but they could have been. The steam train down in Essex, Connecticut, actually, their track begins at the old Saybrook Amtrak station. They have never coordinated connections, but they could. So, some lessons from the Vermonter and this passenger rail experience. If you provide it, and it's a quality service, and it goes places people want to go, they'll ride it. And ridership is growing steadily and continuously on our services here in Vermont. Even a single frequency can be dramatically improved if you add more services to it, as the Valley Flyer has proven down in Massachusetts. Notice that ridership climbed to 116% of FY 2019 on the Ethan Allen, even before it was extended to Burlington. And the Vermonter did it all on a reasonable cost basis. No sleepers, still got food service, but not quite so elaborate as a full diner. But there are negatives, and there are things we need to do better. We need the signals I talked about. We need to go faster without getting crazy about it. But the big thing is we need more than one frequency a day on these lines. And although transportation planners are always terrified if you add a second train you'll double expenses, it never happens. And again, the Downeaster is the perfect example. 5 trips a day for 11 million, we get 1 on each line for 8 million. Frequency matters. And that's perhaps the biggest story to be gained. If you serve more markets, you will carry more riders. I am intensely proud of these services, obviously. This is the great, for me, the great success of my career as an advocate. But I did by no means all this alone. We've had an extraordinary congressional delegation in the state. We've had cross-party support by Democratic and Republican governors without exception, from Howard Dean to the present date for the rail program. We've had the willingness of the state to put state money into this as well as federal money. We've had repeated and multiple grants. And of course, we've benefited the railways themselves by all of this work for passenger service because, in effect, we've rebuilt the mainline railroads in Vermont. So the Vermont rail system has track conditions that Rutland would have killed for in the 1950s. There was nothing like all this welded rail and super elevated curves, and magnificent rock ballast. Same thing true on the Central Vermont route. This is a way to grow and provide options, and in the future, as it becomes more and more difficult to justify automobiles the way we've done them, to continue to provide good public transit. Those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. couple of examples here. This is the Great Castleton Bridge across the Hudson River at Poughkeepsie, New York. This was the way freight trains got around New York City without going across the harbor by ferry boat. But in the early years of Conrail in the 1970s, a tie fire started on this bridge. They never fixed it. It's now the most amazing bike path in America. But a freight train, once again, cannot get around New York City except on a barge or all the way up the Hudson River at Albany. And of course, most particularly, the Island Line. All the talk I've done about going through the Winooski Canyon and upgrading that line to go up through Essex Junction, and we ought to do it. If we had the Island Line, we could probably get to Montreal an hour faster than the way we're going to be able to do it, going around through Essex Junction and St. Albans. This is the text of the history sign that Dolph and Teresa and I and the NRHS people and the Lake Champlain Initiative, people from the Historical Society, helped to get up at the north end of the causeway. Our NRHS group about 4 years ago took a walk on the causeway, and there were no signs anywhere about the history of what the hell it was. And people kept coming up to me saying, "This is wild, is this some abandoned road up here? What was this thing?" So I got the idea of putting up an historical sign. At first I went to Colchester, but they've got one at Airport Park. Now it's 3 miles away from the causeway, but they didn't care. In the summer, there is one at the ferry on the south end of the bike ferry, but you've got to get all the way to the south end of the bike ferry to get to the side. I finally called your town clerk, who put me in touch with Teresa, I believe, and you guys were interested in doing it. It took us about 3 years, and pandemics and the wrath of God and the gates of hell opened or whatever, but we got this wonderful sign up now telling the history of the line, and we all, I think, in this room can be damn proud of it. It is a remarkable piece of history. That line opened in 1901. It was the most beautifully engineered piece of railroad ever built in Vermont, and it barely made it to its 60th birthday. But it's a hell of a bike trail, and probably will never be a railroad again because, as you know, parts of it here on the island are actually now residential streets going by people's houses. But it was an example of, if only we'd had the foresight to keep it. Instead, we have this wonderful, remarkable, unique path. But those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. So thank you.
At the time, we'll give you the exam that we had planned to do.
Right. There'll be a test. Expect to see you down at Union Station at some point the
Are
next
there any
year.
questions or comments for Carl?
Happy to stay. No need to rush off. Yes.
Where do things stand as far as increasing the frequency of either the Vermonter or the Ethan Allen, as you said, would be beneficial?
I don't think it's in the next 3 to 5 years. I wish it was, but we have not scored a breakthrough with V-Trans on that. If there is going to be an increase in frequency, it will be originating one of those Valley Fire trains at Brattleboro, which is a budge, or at White River Junction, which is what I hope they'll do. There are yards at both places so they can service the trains overnight, but that could happen in less time. I think longer term, again, the rail plan does make direct allusion to bringing back Montreal, but I would like to see Burlington to Montreal as well, because there is a tremendous amount of Canadian tourist business that goes to downtown Burlington, not to Essex Junction. And even though you could change trains in Essex Junction or you could change from a train to a bus, it's so near yet so far. North Americans hate to change. If you're only 8 miles from Burlington and you can do it in your car in 2.5 hours anyway, hell, we'll drive down like they do now. So I want to see both trains go to Montreal. And that also would mean double daily service north of Essex Junction. That might be in the cards within less time as well. But
Any of you got a railroad story you'd like to tell, share with us about your
yes, a couple of you guys said you actually have to ride it.
I don't know if this is a railroad story, but
historicals?
when I was a little girl, my sisters were older than I was, and one of them, we lived in what is now sometimes called the Rook's house, right next to the Roy farm.
Oh, Larry.
Oh,
Stand next to her.
oh, okay. When I was a little girl, we lived close to the railroad station, and my sisters were older than I was, and one of them had a good friend across the street, Tootie de Wispelair, and we would go over and go down behind the Wispelair's house to the creek, and we could wave at the engineer as the train went by, and we had a favorite song from Hochelaga called The Cannonball. It was about a train, and we used to sing that as the train rolled by.
Let's hear it.
Listen to the jingle and the rumble. The deluxe accommodations on what
Anybody else got a story or a song they want?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Could you explain how the welded rail accommodates the expansion and contraction issues?
It is tempered before installation at the mill based on what they consider to be the more extreme conditions, e.g. excess heat or excess cold. That said, welded rail does occasionally kink, which means literally it can pop out of the ties and form a letter S. Extreme heat more commonly does that than cold. Cold more commonly might split it. But that's one of the reasons why, in an ideal world, we'd have signals. Because on a signaled railroad, if you've got block signals and something like that happens to track, the signals will probably go red and stop the trains. But compared to the problems the railroads had with jointed rail, braking, going out of alignment, damaging freight cargo, which of course is much more concerning to freight companies than passengers' comfort, welded rail is a gift from God. And in modern times, again, we've gotten good enough at the tempering of the rail that heat kinking is at least not common. But it does sometimes happen.
I think it's more frequent in the west where they have
Yes.
more intense heat.
Much more intense heat, yeah.
When it's really hot around here, they'll put out a restriction on the speed of the train when it's really hot so that they can be prepared to stop it.
Yeah, and that's, in fact, what happened a number of times this summer. We had that extreme long stretch of heat. The New England Central was capping the Vermonter at 40 miles an hour after 12 noon until 6 p.m., which meant that it was typically about an hour late down to Springfield, but better an hour late than on the ground. But there were no kink incidents this summer. We did actually have a rail kinking incident near Amherst, Mass. About 10, 12 years ago, but not recently. The only serious accident that's befallen the Vermonter in its history was a derailment in October of 2015 when it ran into a rock slide down between Roxbury and Northfield. And they're working right now to try to guarantee that doesn't happen again by putting short signal districts with what they call rock slide detector fence, which looks just sort of like a chain link fence along the mountainside. But if a rock strikes it, it will turn the signals red and also provide the dispatcher with a known location. That is, again, very common out in the west, but not so common here in the east. And that will mean there will be several short stretches north of White River Junction, for example, that will have brief signal stretches. But it's not really for trains to pass each other, it's to warn against falling rocks. No one was killed in that accident, but the train did go down an embankment. And it is a testimony to how well built American trains are. American passenger cars were designed to take 800,000 pounds of damage running into a stone wall without failing. No one was killed in an accident, no one was seriously injured, even though the train went off a cliff and dropped 40 feet down an embankment.
Okay, thanks a lot, Carl. You're all welcome to go up and talk to Carl yourself, but we'll hold up the rail.
Thank you all.